our recording. This is May 24th, 2021, and Gateway API meeting. Today we're talking about route delegation, and I'll hand it over to Steve to share more.
Cool. All right, thanks, Rob. Yeah, so I'm hoping to just be able to facilitate, I guess. I'm curious what other folks think about this. So I work on Contour. I have been for a while, so I can help give a perspective as to how Contour kind of looked to address this problem initially. And we can chat about sort of some of the issues that came out of how Contour approached it from users. Yeah, but the goal here is to come up with a way to have routes that get, in a sense, delegated. And that's a tough word to use because that has different meanings. But the idea is to have, I have one route that I own, and I can pass another piece off to somebody else in the cluster. And that means that the part that gets passed off, no one else can utilize that set of, I guess conditions are bad, that's what Contour calls it, but set of route match criteria, right? We don't want to be specific to path because it could be more things like headers and different things. So I try to take all the different issues from 411 and 634 and try to shove them together into one doc, at least to have a place where we can take notes and describe and discuss. So I know John Howard had a good example of having, I own /cats, right? Just to be very simple. And then someone else has /dogs. So the idea is that, if someone creates /cat/food or /dog/food, I'll make this a little bigger, then you'd never have a collision. You never have to go with the logic to figure out who wins because we have some other mechanisms in place to help manage this. So like I said, we can do this on path prefix. We can do this on headers. I know a colleague of mine, Gabriel, he wanted to do this on DNS domain as well. So the idea is having certain subdomains get passed around your cluster as well. So that's sort of another spin on this delegation idea. This was just a picture, I guess, to help talk about it if we had to talk about it. Again, having different namespaces and different types of match criteria. I just thought it might be helpful to have that. So I guess I'll pause here for a second. Do folks, I guess I'm leading this, but where do y'all want to go from here in terms of how to look at this? I have what Contour does today in this next section, and then down here, I pulled out some of the solutions that folks had addressed in different issues that we could also discuss.
I'm interested, maybe first we can go through what Contour does. I think that would help give some context on what's already been done and maybe anything you've learned from that. Sure.
So in Contour, we initially had this thing called ingress route, and I can put this in quotes here, ingress route. And the idea of ingress route was that it was to solve this, the idea was multi-team kind of clusters, right? So in the example here of the dogs and the cats, right? We wanted to have teams self-manage their own path prefixes, right? So if I give the dogs team in this example permission to go manage /dogs, no one else in the cluster can manage that, right? They can fully manage that path. So they can create /dogs, dog/food, /dog/food/ whatever, because they have permission over that. If anyone else in the cluster would try and take that path prefix, then what happens is Contour will throw an error and say, hey, the person who's trying to use it and doesn't have the authority, and it kind of gets thrown out, right? And then the person who does have authority will still route traffic. So in the gateway API world, we'd set a condition on those invalid routes, and then we would, kick them out of the request path. What we found though is that folks want to map on more than just path prefix, right? And then the idea of delegating a header or delegating a DNS domain or something like that didn't make much sense, right? So we switched the idea from this delegation word to this inclusion word, and we kind of flipped it over around the other way. So delegation works with this idea that you have a child route, and that child route gets included certain things, right? So when you go and process through all of your routes, in the dogs and cats example, I can tell someone, hey, the routes in the dogs namespace include a path prefix onto every route into that namespace. So when Contour goes to process it, when that child proxy gets processed, it'll take its conclusion. So in that example, it'll have /dogs. it'll get appended to or prepended to their path, and they can go define things from there. That happens with headers as well. So what you end up with this idea is you have this root proxy, which is where you define your domain name, right? So there can only be one root proxy for a domain name in Contour. And then you can have as many child proxies as you like, right? So each child is either does not specify the domain name, or it has this inclusion path specified across. So I have an example here. I guess a picture would have been better. And I probably could dig one up, but the idea here is that this is my, let me push this down a little bit to put it on the same screen. This is my root proxy here. So here I define my virtual host. So this is root.bar.com. And then here I'm defining my route. So we'll just keep it very simple. So any request, meaning slash, will get routed to the root service in this namespace called routes. Now what I've done is I have this other namespace called child. Now in the child namespace, I'm defining a slash, right? And what happens is in the root, I've had this inclusion mechanism. So I've said, hey, the HTTP proxy called child route, which matches this name, and the namespace child, which again matches, they get the conditions blog. And the conditions in Contour are essentially the route match conditions. So when this goes to process, like I said, it's kind of like an include in C or something, where when you process that document, all of these conditions that get defined here that are included will get stuck onto here. So essentially, any request to slash blog will map to this resource here, this route, because of how this inclusion mechanism happened. Same thing here with slash info. So if I define slash info in the child, it actually turns out to be slash blog slash info, again, because of that inclusion thing. If up here I would define, headers or something else, something like that, then what would happen is all of those headers would get, appended the same way. So this works very well because if someone doesn't have this, inclusion permission or inclusion hierarchy, then other resources we can detect that in the processing and throw those out. What you lose with this and what we come up with is folks sometimes don't want to have this top-down approach, right? Because this requires someone to configure this resource and then configure at least the initial set of inclusions off to different namespaces. If you want a more self-service type configuration, then this kind of is more difficult because you still have to have that initial spot to have folks provision all these sort of initial configuration. I know Nick, you're here, and James, you'd be familiar as well. Or anything else you can?
I have a question.
Or if you want to pause, yeah.
I see that, so it does some munging of the fact that this prefix has to kind of get tacked onto the previous one in the route, along with the other matches. Is that right?
Yes, that's it. Yep.
Okay. And then I see. And then the other one, this is called, the other one didn't require that, or it did? I guess, what's the distinction between the delegation versus?
Yeah, so the thing that we changed between Ingress Route and HTTP Proxy was that for Ingress Route, you didn't have this like prepending behavior. And what that meant was that the Ingress Route sort of needed to know where it was going to be included. So what it meant was that, for this child HTTP proxy, if that was an Ingress Route, all of the paths in that would actually have to have the /blog prefix in them. And if that didn't match, then that Ingress Route would be thrown away. The reason we moved to this one is that this makes the child HTTP proxy composable. So you can import it. It into just this one blog, or you can import it in. You could have like 3 different includes and import it in 3 different places with 3 different sets of conditions, and it would still all work. And that includes the headers and all that sort of stuff.
What
it does?
Yeah, James. One question though: what does the request look like going out to the service? Is it stripped down, or does it also end up with /blog?
It gets the full path. Yeah. So we do have prefix rewrite though. So on the child HTTP proxy for the service, for each of these routes, you can put a prefix rewrite to rewrite the stuff that you get back to slash if that's what you want.
Yeah, so service
I
2
see.
would get
So the
slash blog.
hiding is not like 100%. Like you would somehow need
Yes.
to still coordinate it a little bit.
Yeah, it's not 100%. No. Yeah, I mean, again, it's kind of intended that this is kind of for places where it's kind of expected that there'll be some level of person-to-person communication, not just via the API, which is probably which is definitely something that I think probably could use some improvement.
So one of my questions here is, does anyone actually use this within the same namespace, or is this really primarily intended for delegating some path to a different namespace?
So you guys, do you have any?
Yeah, we have had folks do this. So some folks have done like blue-green deployments from this. So you could, instead of swapping out the services down here, you can swap out where things get included to. That was sort of one thing. And then another thing you can do is you can delegate to yourself and then delegate to other namespaces as well. So as soon as this child has permission to, in this example, /blog, they could then delegate off or include off to another namespace for another, say this team owned 2 different namespaces, one for blog and one for, the info or something.
Yep.
They could then do an inclusion from themselves to another namespace that they own to then, keep passing off their own permission chain.
The other thing that we have seen it used is for doing the cross namespace secret holding. So say you create a root HTTP proxy that holds the master TLS key insert with the secret, that you can put that safely off into into sub highly restricted namespace, and then you delegate / the condition is just / and you delegate that out or include that out from another proxy, and then that one is then the place where you do the other things, right? So you can build a bigger hierarchy, and that then lets you keep the secret details secret, or restricted to a small set of people. That one I have seen people use as well.
Makes sense. Related to this, FQDN is something you can only specify at the root route, right? You can't do that in anything you're delegating, including.
That literally defines a root route. A root.
Okay.
Yeah, if we define the same host down here on a child, it would throw an error. Yeah.
Got it.
Could you do a subdomain of it on a child?
Currently, no.
It'd end up being a whole new root, I guess, as a subdomain.
Basically, it's if that FQDN field is set at all, nope, that's a root proxy. And if you define a subdomain, then you've done something wrong, right? Like, is the current assumption. Not to say we couldn't change that, but like that's how it's currently designed.
Yeah.
We didn't do this with the DNS delegation style in mind.
And so in case of like routing conflicts, or like to figure out what is like, use the user specify /info and then /blog lives in another resource. Have users run into like sort of figuring out what is the real hierarchy, like building that hierarchy, or during debugging? Has that been a problem yet, or not really? Yeah.
We've gone through a few different iterations of designs to handle this. Steve and I have both worked on some PRs on designs to help with this. So there's 2 parts to this discussion, to this problem. Number one, what happens when 2 bits of the DAG tree because it's effectively a DAG that you build of the includes, what happens if 2 of them are the same or they conflict? And then the other thing is, how do you tell people that has happened? And even in the absence of any problems, how do you tell people where their HTTP proxy has been included and with what prefixes and what conditions? So the idea there was to do some stuff in status, like have a very similar construct to what we ended up with listeners for gateway, where the listeners sort of have a thing in there that says which gateway they apply to. My idea was to have the status have a set of these match conditions that or imposed conditions with a thing saying this is where this is the domain name that you've been included under, and this is the conditions you've got, and this is your parent, so that you can go one hop up And then if everything has the parent thing, then you can use that to build a tree like you do with owner reference.
I think I missed this earlier. Is there a limit to the depth of this tree?
No, probably
Oh, wow.
mistake.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but so it is built so that it can handle things of arbitrary depth. What will happen if you try and there's a couple of things. There were a couple of nasty things that came from that, but some of the negative effects of the way that we've designed it are we can't do regex matching on prefix, because when you do, otherwise when you include, you can't tell which ones are which, because you'd have to parse the regex first. You can't do and even globs are a bit dicey. You can do globs where it's a whole path segment, but you can't do sub path segment globs. So right now you can't do any wildcard matching or regex matching or anything like that. It's all exact string match on prefix only. And that's because it interacts really weirdly with the inclusion mechanism otherwise. And the other thing that's you run into weird problems about when you implement it, how you end up with like having to do a lot of parsing, walking of all of the cube objects to verify that everything is you basically have to walk the tree every time for everything until you've built a whole DAG and then marked everything that's not in the DAG as orphaned. So that's the other thing that we do is we mark if something is not a root HTTP proxy and it's not included by anything, then it gets marked as orphaned, and that there is a status that gets set to say, your thing is that we only really have 3 states at the moment. We do have some conditions and stuff, but the roll up states are valid, invalid, and orphaned. Valid effect is quite close to what we ended up with admitted, where it's basically like this is syntactically okay, and points to services that exist and all that sort of stuff. But we don't make any claims about ready or anything like that as well.
That makes sense. Are there any, I know you mentioned that you can't do regex matching. Are there any other kind of limitations with what you could do in a child route, as opposed to like you can't do regex, you can't do domain?
Yeah. If you produce a set of conditions on a subroute like that are mutually exclusionary, then we're like, hey, that's invalid. And we've spent some time working on. It's really difficult to do with partial validity. So if you've got a HTTP proxy that has like 7 included routes, 7 sort of sub routes in the route stanza, but one of them is broken, like what do you do? Right now, we throw the whole thing out, right? So it's very simple to implement, but it's kind of a sucky user experience, because if someone updates, and we've also had problems where if someone goes down the tree, if you are including a HTTP proxy that is itself invalid, what does the owning one do, right? And so is that now partially invalid? And if it's partially invalid, does it get thrown out? Like how far up does the invalidness flow, right? And so that's the other thing that the computing the status and understanding how partial validity works is surprisingly tricky, and there are a lot of weird edge cases. And so you've got to have very clear rules, which we didn't have at the start. We've sort of evolved a set of rules that kind of work, but like you need to have very clear rules about what errors in an included HTTP proxy, in a child HTTP proxy, will be fatal for inclusion, and what won't, and what errors are sort of, you get the idea.
Yep.
So
that's one of the tricky parts. Sorry.
How much of the merging is done in the controller versus rendering it as actual config in Envoy? I guess one consideration is that for it to be portable, it needs to be mostly or all in the controller.
Yep.
And have very little like proxy support for it. This is for this discussion.
Yeah. The way the contour works is that we have like a 3-step model. There's like an ingestion step where you take Kubernetes objects and turn them into a data model. Then once you put things in the data model, then the data model is mutated into Envoy config. So the ingestion step means like having the sort of the the sort of 3-step bit, means that we have the same data model for any of the different sort of Kubernetes objects we support. So whether it's ingress, HTTP proxy, gateway API, all of them get sort of turned into this intermediate DAG, because it is a DAG of load balancer constructs, and so into the intermediate data model, and then the change from that data model to Envoy is a completely separate operation. I mean, there's some leakage, obviously, there usually will be, but we've tried hard to keep sort of API curtains between those two steps to stop exactly what you're talking about, Bowie, where the Envoy stuff bleeds out. I mean, for HTTP proxy, there absolutely have been some Envoy stuff bleed out into the actual API around all of the stuff that when we talked about it for gateway API has been really hard. Timeouts, retry behavior, health checks, that sort of stuff. Like the proxyisms have creeped in because we don't intend Contour to ever use a different proxy for a start path. James, are you unmuted before? Did you have anything you needed to say?
No, I think I was on meeting before, but I think you covered the thing I was going to say.
Another
And
question.
the stuff that's in the middle, that one has to be a very simplified set of features. Like anything that's within a delegation chain, you kind of, if you see any advanced features in there, you basically reject it and say, hey, you're delegating, you can't use those fun stuff, like fun features.
Yeah, so the on the inclusion stanza, the only stuff you can put is the reference to the object and the set of conditions. The set of conditions, the actual struct that implements the conditions, is the same between the includes and the routes. So it's the same struct, the same thing, so it's the same syntax. But you can't. But on routes, you can add stuff like timeout policy, health check policy, load balancing policy, that sort of stuff. But you can't do that on includes, right? So you can't enforce a load balancing policy on an include or a timeout policy on an include, right? Yeah, but there's other ways that you can enforce that sort of stuff if that's what you want to do. But that's not mandated in the HTTP proxy. And so yeah, you're 100% right that there's no way to do. So if you think about it, the DAG that's built here is not actually per object. It's actually sort of per sub part of the object, right? So the includes is like a pointer to another object, and the routes inside any particular HTTP proxy object are effectively the actual thing that you're implementing. So the reason we called it an include is functionally what you're doing is you're taking the route stanza out of the child HTTP proxy and dropping it into the root one. Right, but there's a little bit of code that munges the conditions for you and stuff, but that's effectively what you end up with is one really big HTTP proxy that has a whole bunch of routes with conditions that are sort of been munged a little bit on the way. But so it doesn't really make sense in that model to the conditions on the include are actually like a mutation directive for when you include the child HTTP proxy, not sort of terminal things in themselves.
Yeah, I think the word includes is appropriate because like these aren't routing hops. Like you're not describing a routing graph here. What you're describing is configuration fragments, and that's I think part of the reason why the includes terminology, the project changed to using includes as the terminology to try and kind of emphasize that aspect.
Yeah, we found with delegation that people would think of it as being an extra routing hop, and it's not. It's just config. Jeff, I saw you unmuted before. Did you want to ask something?
I was just going to comment. I'm a product manager on Console from HashiCorp, so not Contour. But we're looking at some of the same issues that you've brought up, where like a NetOps team has seen where app dev teams try to create policies where they would conflict with another app team, and so something like this prefix addresses that. Also, where they want to define some things at that's more higher level of administration, if you will. NetOps who kind of own the public access and delegate some control settings to an app dev team. And so this idea of having, kind of a parent-child relationship works with a lot of the scenarios that we've seen customers running into and needing.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the thing that, as Steve said before, one of the big limitations though is that the HTTP proxy model is solely dependent on people to do the initial, the person who controls the parent HTTP proxy has the responsibility to get the namespace exactly right. We didn't put any facility for label selection or anything like that in there, partly because at the time we didn't have a solution for what we would do if things were conflicting. I think if you fix the conflicting behavior and how things behave when they conflict, then it's much easier to just say, okay, yeah, you get a label selection. Steve, if you could just scroll up a bit. Yeah, so on the include, instead of having a name and namespace, you have like an object reference, a standard Kubernetes object reference that lets you do GVK, or just name, a label selector rather than not GVK, but a label selector. And so yeah, and probably you would end up with a similar set of things to what we have with including routes from gateways. And you might end up with a similar bidirectional thing. I think that design that we've got for the routes between routes and gateways is really useful in this case, as long as we set the default so that most people don't need to use it, like you've said before, Harry.
And we can restrict where these root resources get created. So if you don't want, because Contour doesn't care who creates it. So if you want to say, create a set of admin namespaces that only these can be created in, you can define that, but you can't restrict who can create these. We have had users suggest that maybe like a first in wins is a way around this. So instead of restricting, creating these at first and having to pass them down, that's been one suggestion from folks. Just, like I got there first, so I win this domain and I can then configure it. But we haven't had a good solution yet other than that to work that out.
Yeah, I think Steve brings up an interesting discussion topic here, because I think the security model that in Contour is pretty different than the security model that we've been thinking about in Gateway. And I think, so I'll give you my impression of the Contour security model, and Contour people can correct me. So basically, you can think of creating a gateway as a privileged operation, and you can restrict that to certain namespaces if you want, which lets you like restrict that privileged operation to particular a particular role, more or less. But then privilege kind of is delegated down the configuration tree, right? So you're always including from the top down. So you always have this idea of someone at the root of the hierarchy is more privileged and then includes someone lower down, and effectively that privilege transfers, because then the next layer of the tree can then include something else. Is that a pretty accurate description?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like I like to think of it as carving up the website space, right? So you have like a website that's this big, and then by including, you like carve up this much space and you give it to people, and then they can do whatever they like inside that space. Obviously, this is like not a two-dimensional space, or one, it's multi-dimensional based on the prefix and the headers you set and all. But yeah, but like if you think of it as like some weird multi-dimensional space, then you can like take a chunk of it and give it to people, and then they are free to do the same to further subdivide that space, but they can't expand outwards from what the person who owns the whole space has given them. And so that works poorly if you have people who are like, I just want the people who are lower down in that hierarchy to be able to magically request that domain names get created, say. That is one we had a lot of, where I think we had the issue is called HTTP proxy design encourages bad lifecycle management or something like that. And it's like basically the person is saying, look, because you've designed it in the way you have, the owner of the root HTTP proxy has to manually go in and mutate the root HTTP proxy to if you ever have any extra, if you ever want to add any extra includes. So if you have 30 things that you want to add and 10 are coming and going every hour, then there are that many edits on the root HTTP proxy because there's no dynamic way to select things that are outside.
Which can be solved by writing an additional site-specific controller.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, it's not insolvable, but the API does not lend itself to doing that because that's not what it was designed to do. What it was designed to do.
Is that simply solved by using a selector, or is there something more fundamental there?
So I think if you use a selector, then you need and you've solved, like, you've got a solution for the conflict resolution problem, then yes. But then you can do it. But the solution for conflict resolution and bind and sort of including the HTTP proxies will actually, I suspect, look a lot like the solution for including routes from gateways and the dual directional binding we have there. Sorry, Steve, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, yeah, this eliminates the need for conflict resolution because there aren't ever conflicts because of how it's passed down. So that's that. Which side do you want to live on? Do you want to have a more structured approach, which eliminates conflicts, or a more flexible approach, which then causes you to think about how to deal with those conflicts when they arise?
Yeah, you can conflict. You can conflict with it. You tend to conflict within a level. So, like in the team dogs namespace, you could have two HTTP routes, both specifying a dogs prefix, which would be something that you detect at that layer, at that level.
I do like that it provides more first class of basically encoding ownership of parts of the website. And like, we looked at ways of doing this with domains on Gateway, in which you would just basically do the matching per listener, right? And so you could use the listeners as a way to effectively have domain ownership, but it's a bit kludgy, and it only is subject to the domain itself and no other parts of the header. So that is a nice aspect of it. I do wonder, we talked about kind of policy and, having the policy and configuration flow down, ownership of it flow down the same way. I am interested to see how this would mix with some of the service policy things that we were talking about, because we can add a similar idea of attaching, the ability to attach policy at the gateway, at the route, at the service, and allowing overrides be configurable from the top down. I suppose that seems to be compatible with this. I guess it gives even more places for policy to go because they can go on the route or multiple levels of the route.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I think the policy stuff, the way that Contour ended up doing it is there's effectively only really two levels of policy that you can do. Number one, the global controllers config file policy level. So we allow setting of like some timeout policies that are then the defaults for everything that's created. And then you can set policy at the at the actual route level inside any one HTTP proxy. But because of the way that include works, and it's like you take the config and you put it into the object one layer up, possibly mutating it a little bit. You can't sort of put the policy on the mutation right now. Because, again, we were worried there about conflict and conflict resolution and how you would handle conflicting policies at different levels. So right now we don't have the intermediate policy step that you're sort of talking about, especially in your backend policy thing, Mark. I don't think that it's not unsolvable and in something you couldn't add to this design, but it wasn't something we did along the way. We found that people only wanted, they only really wanted like the two levels of configurability, but the thing they wanted is to be able to override and do set limits around policies. Again, timeout policy is the best example of this. We originally had a thing that would let you set a default client request timeout. And then in your HTTP route, you can set a client request timeout to whatever you want. What we found was that people who are operating a shared proxy, shared ingress controller in like one big ingress controller for an entire cluster that is a multi-tenant one, sometimes an application developer's best interest is for there to be an infinite client request timeout, right? Because that's easiest for them. They don't have to worry about client request timeout anymore. But what happens then is that screws over the cluster admin, because then the proxy never has connection strain because all of the connections for that thing are infinite client request timeout. So if that client goes quiet, then it'll never be reaped and you won't get the connection space back. So you end up with a memory leak. So what people requested us to do is to find some way to make that, to be able to say you can set the client request timeout to anything between 0 seconds, or which means or one, like some arbitrarily small value and some high value with 5 minutes or something like that. But you can't set infinite, and so you can rule out infinite. You can set a bounded value, but you can't rule out you can't do infinite. That was really tricky to make work with the in controller thing. So what we ended up recommending is that we wrote a set of gatekeeper policies, policy templates and policies. And we say, look, if you need that sort of functionality, here's the run gatekeeper, here's the stuff that will help you. And that gatekeeper is better at that sort of operation than we could ever be. Just use gatekeeper. And that stops us needing to build a poor copy of gatekeeper to do that sort of admission control stuff.
Just, I know we have around 20 minutes left. I'm wondering, Steve, you had a few potential solutions that you suggested below. I'm wondering if we can cover some of those as well.
Yeah, I think I pulled out 2 of these from the different issues, and one I just added, or I think it was referenced by someone, like James or someone might have brought it up. But so the first one was having a route forward to another route. So the idea was, you're forward to, instead of it forwarding to a service, it could forward to another, HTTP route. And that would give you a way to give you that cycle. I think this was the issue. Yeah, that described that. So the same kind of thing, kind of like the delegation mechanism or the inclusion. I think you, instead of defining the criteria to forward, you would just pass off to the other route.
Paul Banks, who you're showing there, the comment, he's the architect for console.
Oh, okay.
I work with. So just to put a little context into it.
Okay, very cool. Yeah. I think Nick, you added some things. I just lost my. Yeah. So what's nice about this is this would let us. We don't have to create new objects or change anything in the spec. Just short of allowing the forward to happen to another route. But there's some things where the routing cycles can be hard to detect. We've got to make sure that when you do a forward, that the protocols and everything line up. So we can't route from HTTP to TCP or something like that. And then some route fields may not make sense when you include things. So what if you had another host name defined on a different route that differed from the parent resource? How would you handle those sort of conflicts? I think there's some other type of things that can arise by keeping all of the objects the same.
Yeah, I mean,
how did you guys
essentially
handle, the same thing getting included in multiple places? That one sounds like the one that would get kind of annoying for the user to understand in terms of status.
Yeah, I think that one needs a good status design where you namespace the status by inclusion chain somehow. And that was what I was proposing to do for HTTP proxy, that there's a status that tells you here's how you've been included, but it needs to be namespaced by top level domain or something like that, by the FQDN or something.
Well, I mean, we namespace the status by gateway, so you'd have to.
Yeah. So
somehow, I imagine.
Yeah. I think gateway is the obvious sort of place to put that, and then you'd say, oh, you get it. You are eventually included by this gateway, and here's something that lets you breadcrumb the thing back up the chain. Probably one layer. I'd say, probably one layer is all you really want to do there. You don't want to have a full. You don't want to tell people, oh, this is all the places you've been included in that gateway. But maybe, I don't know. You need to try that out and check, I'd say. So I think
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think all of the issues in this come down to, the benefit is that you don't have to change the API a lot, but you take all the complexity that comes from not changing the API a lot and put it onto controller implementers. But there's a lot more complexity, like the API is, you're taking the complexity out of the API and putting it into the controller, right? And so the implementation guides and stuff like that would need to be far more complicated to explain to people, here's all the things you've got to handle this use case. Whereas I think the other ones may help with that a little bit. You've got to have conflict resolution behavior defined. You've got to be how do you find routing cycles? Here's some tips on finding routing cycles. Here's some tips on how you handle this, and this. And would you mandate some of that stuff? I don't think right now we have a behavior like a way to mandate controller behavior that's not, implement these structures, or that's not based on that API. There's no sort of, you must do, your controller must behave in this way that's not based on a particular field in the API. Sorry, James.
I think the complexity with this approach is that you need to replicate the bidirectional handshake that routes and gateways have. Otherwise, it's trivial to kind of circumvent that. So it's just a matter of the additional complexity, right? We already have complexity concerns around that, and then you kind of replicate that complexity down into some arbitrary hierarchy.
Yeah, it seems like you almost need some kind of more generic parent concept than right now. We assume parent is gateway, whereas with any model like this, parent could be route, it could be another gateway, it could be gateway via route. Like you could have status still be by gateway, and you could have some kind of via this route as an example. Yeah, that it's going to add some complexity, I think, any way we do this, but yeah, it's interesting. I think one other tiny note, I think we'll cover this with other approaches here, is what's been raised earlier is the idea that wording matters a lot. And if we clarify that this isn't another hop and we use a word like include instead of forward, I think that can help with understanding what this is. And I don't think any of us want this to be another network hop.
I'd say one thing that we do with consoles, we have a concept of a virtual service. And so you could target a virtual service, which then that virtual service has routing and routing rules and policies applied to it, which then get applied. So it's a chain, if you will. But it breaks it up a little bit more. It's just a different way of breaking this up, but it provides the kind of the same type of capabilities, I guess I'd say.
Is a virtual service, this concept of a virtual service, is it like a path hierarchy, or is it a host name, or can you make it a bit more concrete?
For the way we do it right now is it's defined in console as a DNS name or service name, in our service catalog. Going forward, we may break that up, and so that there a little more flexibility in that. But that is a name in our service catalog, so it's not a DNS name necessarily visible externally.
So to brutally simplify that, I'm sure this is entirely wrong, but maybe it might be a little bit right. Is it a little bit like using external name service in Kubernetes, like where you point it to a name and maybe that name is external and maybe it's not, and there's and then something else handles and then console itself handles like how do you get to this service?
It's you've got your listener, and it at some point it resolves down to sending traffic to a service, right? And so what we've done is we have a virtual service, so you can chain where one listener forwards traffic to virtual service A or virtual service B based off of your matching criteria, and then virtual service A may target another virtual service for doing some additional processing. Maybe you're doing blue-green deployments, or Canary, where you've got I need to do some things different with my traffic manipulation, my header manipulation, when it's going to the new test version of the application versus going to the standard current production version. Right. So you can just, as the decision tree is going to, what do I need to do now that I've been sent to now that as virtual service A, I receive this traffic, then virtual service A1, who's under it, has the same kind of logic going through it. What do I need to do now that I've got this traffic?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think I see. Okay. Well,
I'm
we've
not,
only got.
I'm not
Yeah, sorry.
proposing virtual service. I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah.
saying that's a way we've handled this so far.
Yep.
The next thing that Rob sort of hinted at was taking this and having a new type, a new struct that we can define. So instead of routing to itself over and over, which can cause lots of issues, we can define a new type which would explicitly define, hey, these are things that you can delegate, include, pass off, whatever name we can stick in there to make clear. So this way you can define, like, so if you're going to pass off a path or a set of headers, we can restrict domain name maybe, and maybe subdomain for Gabriel's case would work. It makes it very clear what you're doing, so you don't have to infer what's going to happen, because you can explicitly say, hey, this is a delegated route. This is this is the behavior that we're looking for. The downsides of this is that we're going to duplicate code, and you're going to have lots of extra work in your controllers and in the API spec to help redefine some of the same things over and over and over.
Yeah, I think that's why I put the will require a delegated X route, because that pattern really strikes me as really similar to what they ended up with, in federation, where you end up with like a federated object. You end up with a federated version of the object and a regular version of the object. And so we'd end up with like a delegated version of any routes that support delegation. I mean, again, that comes back to the benefits that it makes clear which routes support delegation, and it means that the logic to support the delegation is in the definition of the delegated route. But so I don't think you'd be really able to do a delegated TCP route, for example. That wouldn't really make sense, but a delegated HTTP route for sure, maybe a delegated TLS route.
So I was
it's
going
this
to say
model
that delegation only really makes sense for certain protocols, most likely. So it's not a terrible blowout in terms of this delegated cross X.
Plus, this is
where does this go to? Sorry, is it the gateway has routes? So you go from gateway to delegated route, and then the delegated route in references to a route. Is that so? A delegated route is always a parent of a HTTP route or a tier or something like that.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah. So it's
one issue, which is that once I've delegated down, I don't necessarily care that the person I delegated to is delegated or not delegated. I don't know how important that is, but that is something that ends up leaking up in this case.
Yeah. So, and that would matter here, because you'd have to delegate to a kind, right? Like you're not going to be able to delegate to multiple kinds probably. And so the other thing that I see here, though, the way that I would say this is that if you have this intermediate object, then when you're building the inclusion DAG, the route objects are the leaf nodes, and the gateway object is the root node, and any intermediate nodes have to be this new type.
So just to pull back a little, what are the parameters based on which you usually find users including in or doing delegation? What some I have heard of is right now is like headers, header, host name, and then path. Is there anything more? We
haven't had, so the only other request we've had is from Gabe to do like a subdomain. But aside from those three things, that's all we've ever been asked for. And even then, subdomain is pretty.
Why do you need subdomain? Can't you work around subdomain pretty easily by creating by doing matching?
You absolutely can. Yeah, you absolutely can. But I think that what Gabe is asking for is being able to, correct me if I'm wrong, Gabe, is to be able to have one place where you do example.com and then you hand out exactly like DNS delegation, you hand out responsibility for some subdomain of that upper domain to some other team. Is that right, Gabe?
Yeah, like we don't want to have to edit the global gateway object in order for one of my team's sub-teams to make a change to their routing.
Yeah, so if they want to add, app.team1, you don't want to have to mess with the gateway to do that. That's what you're saying?
Yep.
I don't know. It also, again, it seems like something that can be really easily solved by like an additional controller without expanding the API surface.
I think that same argument could be made against all of the path-based delegation, right?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, maybe. And I guess that's like, conceptually, it's like where does the complexity go? Do you make the API more complex to solve all these problems, or do you just kind of add a helper API on top of the fundamentals?
Yeah, I think regardless of exactly where this ends up being implemented, it's definitely a request, like a use case that we have been requested. So, so it's relevant to the discussion. Whether or not we end up doing it, I don't know, but it's definitely relevant as a use case, and that was the question that Harry was asking. I think in terms of actual use of this, Harry, is that path prefix is absolutely the most used. Headers is less, but still used. And as I said, we haven't seen much usage because we don't have the DNS domain functionality. But but the DNS domain functionality absolutely is. You would address some of the use cases that we have had that we haven't been able to handle.
So the reason I ask that is this seems to be a very targeted problem to a very specific protocol because that's the most I think used protocol. So we should think about from a solutioning perspective, we should also have something very targeted to solve this specific problem.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. That is this only a problem for HTTP route? Is a fair question to ask. And if so, do we then just make special stuff for HTTP route and not make it more general for the rest of the API? I think that's a very fair question to ask, because I don't think, because the only way that I would see that not being the case is if you're doing the DNS domain subdomain, then TLS route might would have a really strong interaction with, and SNI routing would have a really strong interaction with being able to subdivide the DNS domain, right, and and chop out the different SNIs and stuff like that. That would be the most obvious thing. But aside from that, I don't see any other routes, even custom routes, that would need this sort of thing.
And we do have I know it's not exactly included delegation, but we do have DNS domain and subdomain delegation, right, to namespaces using listeners. So we do have some power of that inside existing gateway, right? So right now, and this is me thinking out loud, is I'm thinking if, I don't know about headers, but what if there is, for HTTP listeners, you add a path prefix to it. Right now, you have delegation inside the gateway resource only, but now you cannot compose it, right? You cannot have a gateway pointing to a gateway, right, or something like that. So it's much more simpler, but does it solve for even 80% of the use cases, right? And then sort of incline more towards what James is saying, right? How much complexity do you want to put in the API versus writing a controller for it?
Yeah, I think one thing that I probably missed out of that though is that there's not as many people using the include functionality, but the people who do, they really, really desperately need it. If you have a complex enough use case that you need this functionality, it can be, they'll need it for a lot of things. You'll be talking about thousands of objects, or the reason that you want this sort of functionality is because you've got something that's not tractable on a human level, right? You can't just have a person do changes and stuff like this. Some machine scale level of where you've got lots of objects or lots of churn or some other thing like that, right? And that's why you want an API to help you with this, is because you don't want to have a person in the loop for every change.
For those use cases, is it primarily a wide model? They just want to, spray pretty wide, or is there a lot of depth to their delegation inclusion?
So I'll be honest, we don't have really good information about exactly what they're doing. Like it's really hard to get people to talk about their exact setup, but my gut feeling is that it's mainly wide, that people aren't going 10 includes deep, right? Like, they're maybe going 1 or 2, and then they're having a lot of root HTTP proxies.
I would agree that based off the customers I've talked to as well.
Yeah, but I mean, that said, like we definitely absolutely have people who have thousands of HTTP proxies because they have logged issues about Envoy memory usage a number of times.
Yeah, I would say by Conway's law, if you had a very deep hierarchy, you would have like a pretty impressive organizational chart.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, just 2 minutes left. I know the last one here was I think similar to the first one, but just limiting what can be forwarded to by defining a terminal section or a terminal spot.
Yeah, so you can only have so many levels.
Right. So very similar to the first one. So.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I think that the feedback that we've got from people is that they really like being able to use the include functionality in HTTP proxy. Like that is, we have definitely got feedback that people like that, to have some sort of include functionality. So I think my feeling is that having something that would let you do something like that, even if it is only for HTTP routes, would be really useful. I think it's a very fair point that Harry made, that maybe this is only a HTTP problem and we should not, like warp the whole API to solve a problem that's HTTP only. But I think that it certainly is worth asking, like, if you're going to do something like this for a TLS route, how would it work and what would it look like? Like, it's going to be a domain name delegation thing. Like, because that's the only attribute you have on a TLS route is the SNI. But but as Bowie alluded to before, like I don't think there's going to be many more places where this sort of thing is going to be relevant than HTTP route and TLS route. I mean, for Contour, that's all we do, so it's very relevant to us. But and so I'm always going to have stuff. So yeah, and I think, sorry Harry, I think we all got to go. But we absolutely need more discussion on this. But at least this way, we can sort of say we're all starting this from the same place to some extent. And so I think there's the idea here was to level set a bit and have people think about what they think about what we should do in the API versus what we shouldn't. Is that fair to say, Steve? Sorry, you did all the work of writing this document and I just took over talking over you. So I apologize, mate.
No worries. We're all here together. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. So it's all good. Yeah, I think we're out of time now. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This was an awesome discussion. Thanks, Steve, for getting everything set up for this, and great doc and great discussion. And we'll talk to everyone next week.
Cool. Take care, y'all.
See you.